Okay, so welcome everybody, and thank you so much for joining me today here to talk about framing theory. Quick introduction of everybody here, although many of you already know these great scholars. Porismita Borah is from Washington State University. Paul D'Angelo is from the College of New Jersey, and Dror Walter is from Georgia State University. And of course, I'm Guy Golan, Texas Christian University. So today we're just going to have a very laid-back conversation about framing theory and some of the challenges and opportunities for scholars in the field. And Paul, let's start with you. People use the term framing in so many different ways. If you had to describe to somebody what framing really is all about, how would you explain it?
Well, I think the best way for me to do that is to sort of rehash how I've been working on the theoretical side of framing for the past 20 years or so. So if it's okay with you, just a few notes that relate to that question, because it's an important question. It's one in the disciplines that we work in that is ever sort of scrutinized as if we haven't found the right definition yet. And my work has always been about there isn't one right definition of framing. So ever since my article in 2002 in Journal of Communication, the one about paradigms, I've shied away from offering or stating a formal conceptual definition of framing. And the reason why is because the conceptual definitions of framing that we as scholars take as gospel are actually specifying aspects of a larger process. So what I've done is back up over the past 20 years and put forward a heuristic definition of framing built from its use across all the disciplines and the social sciences and the humanities. And that definition is found in one of my recent publications, and it says that framing signifies the structuring power of context in situations and settings in which people produce and share messages. So that's what I would tell someone, that context matters in terms of producing messages and eliciting certain responses. So then just quickly from that heuristic definition, I put that definition to use in the realms of journalism and news, which is what we all study, and articulated 4 types of frames. Now, of course, I'm not the first person to do this. Bertrand Schäufele and others have worked on these ideas that there are journalist frames, issue frames, which, by the way, do include aspects of equivalency, audience frames, and news frames. I show how contextual definitions that we take as gospel are a rigorous, expansive, selective guideposts for empirical inquiry. In other words, they draw on those 4 types, and they build definitions from those 4 types. And in one of my publications, I looked at Price and Tewksbury's and Power's definition in that light, Gamson and Modigliani's definition in that light, and Robert Entman's various definitions in that light, showing again that they're rigorous, expansive, yet selective guideposts for empirical inquiry. They're not gospel. We don't need a single gospel definition of framing because the process is so big. It's all about context.
I would love that. So I would like some of the other panelists to jump in and contextualize what Paul just spoke about. How do you all understand framing?
I mean, I agree. I think it's really interesting. What really draws me to framing research is the fact that we have so many different ways of understanding framing. It's not just one way of defining or one way of studying. We study. In my mind, there are these different processes of studying framing, right? I mean, first of all, you understand the production of frames. Where do frames come from in the first place? The sociology of news and all of that sort of research that goes into how framing works. And then we look at the content of frames, right? In like media content or any other visuals or wherever we want to study, or big now social media data, understanding the type of frames that are available. And then we study the impact of these frames on audience members. So framing effect studies, where we get into, whether it is equivalency framing or emphasis framing, or how that might change our attitudes or even behavior because of the types of frames that we are exposed to. And a lot of times these are done in experimental studies. More and more sophisticated studies are looking at longitudinal experimental studies. So these are different ways of understanding framing, and I think that's really the beauty of this research, that brings in so many different understanding of the concept from rhetoric and language and sociology and psychology and political science, of course, communication, all of that coming together to understand something which I think is very, very important and becoming really interesting too with social media data, where where you're looking at the rhetoric that how it's framed on platforms like Twitter, for instance, right? So I think I agree that it's really this variety of ways of understanding framing makes it really interesting in my mind.
But it also makes it kind of challenging in a way. And Professor Walter, I'll jump to you in a second, but both of you presented the various ways that people are using framing in different areas of research. But in a way, this is almost like a challenge because there is no set definition, and because, and I want to touch upon this, and I'll let Professor Walter address this if I can, and that is the notion that for some people, framing really is about content selection and content definition. Meaning, so if you go back to Entman's, Paul, you said one of his various definitions, but here's a problem, here's the cause of the problem, here's a moral attribution, here's a solution, right? So we take something that's abstract and we define it for the audience to read. But Professor Borah, you were speaking about the fact that it's also a media effect for some people, right? Framing effect. So, and I do a lot of agenda setting research. So there's always lots of confusion. Is framing content specific or is it a media effect? With that, Dror, take it away.
So I think you turned this to me because, my entry to framing really comes from a methodological perspective. And from a methodological perspective, it seems like we have a bit more of a pressure to unify a theory of framing, or at least to find a codified systematic way that we can apply to different contexts. And I completely identify with the sentiment that this fragmentation of framing is not an issue by itself, because fragmentation, yes, it can lead to ferment and it can be great for theory. But Pori, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think I saw you talking also about some of the issues of having too many unique frames, and the problem of when each researcher invents these new frames for different contexts, we start to have problems of comparability within context, but also between contexts. So we have different theories that talk about foreign countries framing or protest framing. And then when we want to compare protest framing to a framing of elections, we find a problem because it's not the same scale that we can compare and use. So my entryway was methodological, and I think when we think about framing, context of course matters. And I think the root of framing in the end is in kind of rituals of how to write about things. And I think news framing are kind of like the best case for that, because we know journalists are kind of socialized and professionalized to speak in specific ways about specific events and context. So that's kind of what creates framing. And I think if we live from that point, we can kind of think about things that might be not in terms of definition. It's not like framing has one definition, but there are components in framing that we can kind of track, and at least in a methodological way, kind of find ways to measure them in the content. And in here, I would love to elaborate, because this method is kind of like something I'm very passionate about. But first, I would love to hear your opinions also on this. I think we touched on this tension, but this tension between, on the one hand, we don't want to limit framing research and make it only equivalency framing, only gain and loss, and everything else should not be framing, which I know is a sentiment and ideas that have been raised by other scholars in the field. On the other hand, we don't want to have too many theories of framing that are just not working together, and basically researchers that don't have any common ground to speak with each other.
I think, I mean, this question has been asked. I've had this conversation with people before about, how do you deal with unique frames versus which are more consistent frames? And I've always maintained that, and in my article too, which was published 2011, I'm forgetting now, in JOC, where I do talk about the problems of having unique frames, too many unique frames, because it just you see, when I did the systematic analysis, and that was a long time ago, where I found that there were so many studies with just unique frame after frame after frame after. They're all called framing research, and I'm again not necessarily looking down upon any of that. But what I'm saying, I think what I always maintain is that it really depends on the context, and a lot of the studies where I have looked at content analysis, for instance, there might be a need for even methodologically, when you are looking at the you're trying to come up with a content, sort of a document, to a coding document to make this, to do the content analysis. There are times where there are certain issues where the consistent frames that we already have, for instance, episodic versus thematic, very commonly used, horse race frame, strategic frame, issue frame. Some of these frames might not be able to really get into that context of some issues, and that there might be need for some of these unique frames. But what I always meant, what I had written at that time too, that I was a graduate student that time, but was that balance the two. I believe. I mean, try don't just write about, don't just have only unique frames. If possible, try to introduce the broader frames that are already there, and how do you how do you associate the unique or the particular context of that study with the broader frames that we already have, so that, as you said, Dror, methodologically or even theoretically, how do we connect from what we already have to what what the new study that we are doing? So I always have maintained that, but I know there's so many challenges to that, kind of actually being able to do that, or to be able to study, I think, both emphasis and unique frames, or unique and consistent frames. So I know Paul might have some answers to this question.
Yeah, I mean, this is what I've been trying to reconcile, I guess, for the past 20 years. This idea that there's one process, but a lot of ways to, and we maybe don't know the whole process. That I tried to model it way back when. There's lots of great models in the literature. Price, Tewksbury, and Power have modeled it. Jörg Mathis in some of his works have tried to model it. And so in a kind of a positivistic sense, and there's a process out there, and there's one process, but it has a lot of different parts. And that's the approach I've been taking for so long, since talking about paradigms, which was meant to say, look, if we adopt a pluralistic stance toward this process and allow for theoretical integration and fermentation, with the inevitable condition of fragmentation at times, okay, or specialization, perhaps is a better word than fragmentation. We're invariably going to have that. We're going to be much better off in understanding how aspects of this process works, and there's no study, no essay that can capture the whole process. And so that was the idea behind, again, borrowing from others. I admit, Bertram Schäufele, for example, borrowing, the idea that there's a typology we could use, and if we use that typology, we can discuss more intelligently what, for example, strategy and issue frames are in the context, perhaps, of what journalists do to reality, as opposed to some other way of looking at of news coverage. We can talk about the specific frames you decry a little bit, of course, Corey, in terms of issue frames, which are derived from content. In fact, Mathis did that wonderful piece years ago in which he took Entman's 4 functions and used a frame extraction process. And what came out were very specific frames. That's what comes out when you talk about issues. And so for me, there's nothing wrong with that. I was a little, at the time, Jörg and I had these arguments all the time, a little dismayed that in the end, they seemed a little too close to topics than to frames, but that was another argument. There's room for a lot of, again, I guess I'm going to go to my grave thinking this, there's room for a pluralistic approach, so that when we talk about different contexts in which journalists do their work, say elections, in which audiences perceive information, in which issues are developed, then we are better off in terms of like understanding the process if we allow ourselves some leeway with the types of frames.
Yeah. Well, I think this was a great discussion, but I think we're not even close to clarifying. I think we're a little more confused. There are so many studies on framing, and some people treat it as a theory, and some treat it as a paradigm, some treat it as a mechanism. Is framing a theory, and where does it fit in the greater scope of other mass communication theories? Who wants to take that on?
You want me to start?
Sure.
I tend to think of framing as a process of theory integration more than a particular theory. I think Steve Reese has this view as well, and others, sort of think along these lines. To me, a theory is a set of propositions that relate concepts to one another in order to describe a process. So if there's multiple sort of ways of getting at this process, the different paradigms, for example, then I'm hard pressed to say there is a theory of framing. Perhaps that there are multiple theories that, are they all equally useful? I don't know. Okay, that's another question, another issue. Are they all equally amenable to various methodologies? I'm not sure. Okay, but so I tend to think of it as a process of theory integration, an academic process of theory integration than a theory.
I think this is an interesting question. I often ask myself when I do framing research in different contexts, whether there is a connection between these frames. And I think, and it connects to what Paul said earlier about how do we look and how do we find frames. And I find Mate's approach very interesting. I do think we had this whole era in the beginning of the 2000s when people started looking at topics rather than frames and treating topics as frames, because we had great tools to look at topics. So they just treated topics as frames. And that's basically looking under the searchlight for what you can find. And that's the problem. And I think these methods were extremely valuable. They're great at finding these building blocks. And Van Gorp has this kind of interesting concepts of frame elements and frame packages. We treat frames, as you said, as a collection. It's not just a topic. It's a collection of topics and arguments and symbols and images that together connect to some coherent theme. And again, I find the best entryway for that to be a methodological one, because I think we know now how we can find symbols. We know how we can find repeating arguments. We know how we can find topics. And we also have good ways on how to cluster them together. And we do have this assumption that because of the nature of journalistic work, at least, frame elements, parts of frames that are part of a bigger frame will usually tend to appear together and not appear with frame elements from another frame. So if you're a journalist and you are writing on Black Lives Matter, for example, and you're using the public order frame, we will see more images of burning cars. We will see more discussion of how many people have been injured, what the police has done. And that will give us kind of like a cluster of all kinds of arguments that seem to coalesce together into public order. And on the other hand, when you're going to talk about Breonna Taylor, you're going to talk also about George Floyd. You're going to talk about issues of slavery, for example, or inequality in the United States. And all of this will connect to another frame. And these arguments will tend to appear with the arguments that they already kind of belong to the same frame with. So I think this entryway is a great way to codify what we think about when we think about framing. It's not a conceptual perspective of framing has to be A, B, and C. It's more of a procedural conceptualization of framing, of basically framing has to operate in that way linguistically at least. And I think when we do that, that's when we might go from a multiple theory to a, I'm not sure we're ever, yes, going to get to a unified theory of framing. I also don't think I think this is way too optimistic, but I think there is a connection. When I look at something like, so we have strategy and issue frames. Strategy is talking about the polls and what the candidates are doing in order to be elected, what their media strategy is. Issue is when we actually talk about healthcare, when we actually talk about economic inequality, defense, things like that. I think there is a connection there. I think when I see this dichotomy between public order and the actual grievances of the movement, and when I see the dichotomy of strategy frames versus issue frames, it does seem there is some kind of kinship between strategy and between public order. Both of them don't talk about the core of the thing, they talk about the process that leads to that thing. And it seems like there is some kind of a similarity. So again, I'm not sure there is an answer here, but my question is whether in the future we will be able to find some kind of line that tells us frames not always, but usually tend to be divided to this kind of dichotomy. Frames, a frame that deals with something X that usually is in contrast with frames that deal with something Y. Similar to episodic and thematic, just way more wider and able to be applied to more contexts.
I do agree. I mean, I don't think we have an answer to this, you know, and I also wonder if we need a unified theory of framing, do we, or not? And I'm all for, you know, all for having sophisticated methodologies and you know, the best of methodologies to understand whether we are doing quantitative or qualitative research. We need good methods first, and to understand these phenomena. But framing, like all other things, I mean, the more you know, the more confused you get, I guess. You know, that's just true of how much I remember as a PhD student, the more I read, the more confused I was. I mean, you know, then you realize that you know so less. So it's framing is no different. The whole literature is no different from any of the other literature that we read. And you know, like I said, the more you read, and it seems like you know less. And you know, so that's I think that's where some of the confusion comes from. But yeah.
It's quite ironic, isn't it? I mean, if we cannot agree that the sky is blue, right? I mean, then how can we treat the, you know, concept of color if there's disagreement about basic premises, right? Paul,
Guy, one thing, you know, if we can't agree the sky is blue, it doesn't mean we don't agree there's not a sky. Mm-hmm. And so, you know, that's how, again, I see this. I think fermentation. We should remember. I think that Robert Entman's famous piece occurred in the 1993 Journal of Communication in that fermentation series. I think there was 2 journal editions, and so I see it as fermentation. And anyway, I'm sorry to interrupt.
No, it's all good. I actually want to go back to something you said before, Paul, about the fact that lots of the framing research came from journalism, in the journalism field, where the emphasis was on journalists, editors, producers, and how they bring meaning to news stories. In the last 20 years, we've had the empowerment of the audience. Audience members not only consume news passively, but are a part of content creation and meaning creation, right? So I want to bring this question to the forum here and ask, do you think there's a brand new opportunity for framing research here, looking at the audience role in construction of meaning, and how could that play into framing? And does the existing literature, is it enough already to address this topic, or is there an opportunity here for a new line of research?
It's a great question. Yes, the answer is yes. There are new opportunities here. I'm not that versed in them yet. It strikes me that journalists have always been listening to audiences. I told you, Guy, in one of our previous conversations that one of my intellectual crushes is Tian Van Dyke's work, in which he talks about journalists as information processors. And they've always been sort of trying to figure out what kinds of information to work on when they're telling stories. And now they just have, I guess, more of it, okay, with social media. And of course, that's probably a very simplistic view of the role social media plays in journalists' content creation, as you put it, and frame building. But yeah, I maybe someone else can elaborate more, but I think there's a lot of opportunities here looking at hashtags, for example, and their role in framing, among other things.
I agree. I think Dror might be more
Yeah.
more to this his work more on this area. But I agree. I mean, I think there's so much potential in that area now to understand how audiences are creating frames every day and how they're being picked up by journalists, or even how politicians are creating frames and how they are being picked up by journalists through using Twitter as a source or other other platforms like that. So I think there's a lot of opportunity in that area to study. But yeah, to answer your question, I think I agree too that I think there is. I mean, it is for sure that there's some frame creation from audience members as well.
Before I give the floor to Dror, I do want to take this concept and really clarify it to simple real life terms. Back in the day, journalists, when they had to cover a topic that they were not exactly sure how to cover, they would often rely on elites, or they would often rely on their bosses, right? The editors, the producers, or they would look at other media outlets and say, let's see how other journalists are telling the same story. And the audience was in the back of their mind, right? What do people in my community expect or think, or how they view the world? The difference is that today, if a journalist brings about a frame that may be unpopular, they're immediately going to be punished on it on Twitter, right? So the New York Times publishes an op-ed and people in the newsroom don't like it or readers don't like it, they're going to have to respond to them immediately. There's going to be a backlash from the readers immediately. So my question really is about not only the ability of audiences to take in certain frames, but also challenge them on the spot. And how is this changing the news production process overall and frame production? And Professor Walter, I'll give it back to you.
I think it's a fascinating question. I think for me, at least, for some weird reason, I find frame building processes to be more interesting even than frame setting. The idea of how frames come to be, what shape frames, and we have all these, yes, classic kind of variables that you use, for example, for journalistic work, which I think are fascinating. And the question is, how does audience factor into that? That will be one question. And the second will be, how does audience operate differently? Is this just audiences parroting frames that they learned from the news and therefore it's a bit less interesting? We just have this process. Do we have a reverse frame setting effect where audiences kind of transfer frames to the media, something like that, which will be a fascinating question. And I do think, Pori, I do remember, so a lot of our work was based on your beginning work, doing election research on Twitter and trying to understand how people speak about elections. And I think one of the most disappointing things for me was we looked at social protest and we look at elections, and a lot of times we don't find new frames. We were hoping that there will be something in social media that Nelson and Oxley never saw in news coverage of social protest, that Capella and Jamieson never saw in the coverage of elections, and audiences on Twitter will be really different and give us something new. And for now, it seems like we found new frames, but these new frames appeared in the news first. It's something that there is no something which is essentially new to audiences that we could find in our research, and that was a bit disappointing. And I would be happy to hear whether Pori or Paul ever heard about, because I think this is something which I'm interested in hearing whether there is something like that. We also looked not only on regular audiences, we tried to look also at elite, for example, in Twitter. And we find that on the one hand, look at elites, have an election, still found the really strong bottom strategy. It behaved different because it's so focused on strategy, never pays attention. It makes it to issue audiences.
You're a little frozen, so let's give Pori the opportunity to answer what she understood.
I wasn't. I didn't get to hear what he was exactly. It all froze at some point, but I think what he was saying was really interesting. What I got from his, at least the last time I heard, was that the frame seems to be very similar. What he was saying, right? That's the journalist frames were again repeated by. Perhaps repeated by the audience, which is really interesting. I haven't done very extensive study on this. I've done some intermedia agenda setting kind of studies where you see, different at different times, whether it is social media setting the agenda or it is the mainstream media setting the agenda, kind of a question. I've looked at some, but I haven't really looked at frames as such. So I'm not able to speak from my own research, but I don't know if Paul, if you have some of.
So, I'm not able to speak again from my own research either. Most of my research, Walter, was on elections, had to do with mediatization, and also with how strategy and issue frames are covered within the context of character and policy. But I think, one type of area or place that framing research can and is going is toward looking at certainly comments, how comments seem to reflect even if it's just a tweet, or certainly if it's a news story, how comments seem to reflect what's being framed by whoever produced the story. And so what you end up, and there's certainly way more than that as well, ways to explore and end up with not with a linear conception, but with a recursive conception, which is, I think, what Walter you're talking about, and Guy, you as well, a kind of recursive conception in which journalists are processing information, audiences are processing it, sharing it, curating it, and together we're getting a richer and perhaps more cacophonous and difficult conception of indeed what an issue culture even is anymore. When Gamson and Modigliani talked about an issue culture, it was kind of simple. They're talking about print news, 3 networks in the United States anyway. Now the issue cultures that grow in a different way and a more variegated way, and you cannot. And the audience was always involved before, but it's involved in different ways now. And this is where the research I'm looking at or trying to digest as I keep thinking about framing.
Well, I got to tell you, as I expected, time just flew by and we're just scratching the surface. And I really hope that this is going to be the first of many online discussions. Now that we can really go to conferences and see each other in person, we keep the conversation going. I want to ask each one of you for one final question, and that is, where do you think this is all going in terms of framing? What area of research within framing are you most excited about these days?
Ladies first.
I'm excited about. I'm actually excited about some framing research that I've done long time ago as a graduate student, looking at frame production. So I think going back to Dror was talking about how you find that interesting as well, about frame building. Where do frames come from in the first place? And so something that I'm working on a project right now, interviewing journalists and understanding where how they use Twitter as a source and what kind of frames they use. And I'm quite excited about that project right now. But as always, I'm always looking for research to do on framing, and looking at framing effects is also interesting to me. So yeah.
Sure.
So I will let Paul have the last word, but yeah, I mean clearly from everything I said here, I'm clearly excited about advances in measuring framing, and I think we were kind of also pushed to that because back in the day where all you had to go is over 4 newspapers, it was a bit easier. But today, if you want to talk about framing of audiences in Twitter, you have to find a way to address millions of tweets. And I think computational methods are becoming somewhat important in communication research, and I think they hold a great promise for this type of measurement. But I think they also have Another unique quality, which I haven't even had a chance to talk, which I think framing is a great nexus. It was always a great nexus for the meeting of more quantitative and qualitative research in communication. And I think framing and computational methods are especially a fertile ground for this cooperation, because these computational methods cannot work without interpretation, and often qualitative interpretation. So a lot of my work as a researcher, but also as an educator working with grad students, for example, was to be able to take these students who are very well versed in rhetorics and very well versed in qualitative type of research, and try to get them to go into this kind of frame analysis and computation analysis and put it all together. And I'm very excited about this developing to the future in terms of frame measurement.
And to cap it off, yeah, those are so very exciting things, Dror. They're just really important avenues to keep, pushing the methodological methodologies of doing framing analysis. But for me, I'm always looking back for some reason. And that's just, instead of looking forward, looking back at what we've done and how definitions we again that are gospel, like strategy and issue, can be reinterpreted in as time goes on. And one idea that strikes me that I want to get to work on is the idea reconnect framing to its normative aspects of journalism, not as opposed to, but along with it, methodological. And for me, strategy and issue framing is important. I mean, it seems to me journalists cannot tell the issue story without elements of strategy. And in fact, they would be, contra to Patterson, it would be wrong to do that, because put together, that's a more powerful way for journalists to hold elites accountable than it would be if it were just issue coverage by itself. And so I'm always looking back, Dror's looking forward, Pori's looking back and forward, I suppose. But together, we're working in an area that is very vibrant.
Absolutely, and there's so much more work to be done. So for anybody who's watching, we all look forward to seeing your research and your research coming to publication, and let's keep the conversation going. So thank you all very much.